Today is Sunday, September 7th, 2025, and the purpose of my video today is to provide some additional information about Great Island. We have some appropriation requests coming up, and I wanted to make sure everybody had a clear summary of both where we are at the moment with Great Island, but also where we're going in terms of immediate next steps, as well as longer term. So I'm going to see if I can share my screen here and get this to work. 1 second. Okay, let's get started. So I'm going to talk about a few things today. First is a summary of the master plan and timeline, where we are at the moment and what's in the master plan and how to think about it. Second is some detail on the next phase for Great Island, including what we're calling the early access project, Reed Hildebrand's involvement, as well as some economics and the appropriation request. Third is the frequently asked questions. So I sent out a survey, and I appreciate many of you responding and providing me with the questions that you really wanted answered, and I'll try to get to those, and then I'll wrap things up with a summary. So let's get started with the master plan itself. It's useful to review just briefly a timeline of where we are. Negotiation and purchase of Great Island started in 2022 and didn't really wrap up until the end of 2023. Big thank you, as always, to Monica McNally and Jim Palin for their leadership of that effort, but certainly took a great deal of time, both from them as well as everyone else who assisted with that. Towards the end of that process, we formed the Great Island Advisory Committee to really help oversee the development of a master plan for Great Island. And as part of that process, one of the things they had to deal with almost immediately was access to the island, both in terms of people and dogs. And I believe they worked through all that pretty well, but that was a contentious process that I think they helped lead to a good, successful point. Reed Hildebrand, we brought them on board in the summer of 2024 after a competitive process. They got started with their work almost immediately, which entailed, first and foremost, reaching out to the public for input into this process. And they did that through a series of workshops and surveys. We had 4 separate workshops with the public, as well as 3 different surveys that I think cumulatively we received over 5,000 responses to. And so I feel like they orchestrated and led a terrific process, both for developing our master plan and strategy, as well as getting public input into that process. I would point out briefly the 23A legal process you see here on the timeline. One of the things that we had to do when this became a municipal property was ensure that we had proper access. And that access includes not just emergency access, but as well 2-lane access up to Great Island for not just town vehicles, but for citizens to get there by car at some point. As part of that process, we had to widen the roadway that goes from the end of Rings End Bridge up to the traffic circle. And that unfortunately entailed taking down about 15 mature trees along that roadway. And that was really unfortunate, but there was really not a way that we could see that enabled us to keep those trees in place. Longer discussion, but we really had no choice. As part of that process, we posted the trees to be taken down, and that decision was challenged. First to the tree warden, and the tree warden ruled in favor of the town. And then 2 individuals decided to take it further, and they filed their challenge with Stamford Superior Court. And it took many months to work through that process. They were well within their right to pursue that, but it was a protracted effort to try to get through it, and ended up actually costing the town about $80,000 in legal fees to work through that. But we finally did prevail in court, and we were able to take those trees down. The good news is that, and that was really just this past spring, the good news is that we have a substantial replanting plan. 150 different trees and bushes will be replacing those trees we took down sometime this spring. So further good news is that even though we had to take down those trees, which we certainly did not want to or like doing, there are about 4,000 trees on Great Island itself that we've cataloged. And because we bought the land as opposed to a developer, many of those trees are going to be saved as part of that in a way that they might not have been had the property been sold to a developer. So I know it's unfortunate that we had the cost of taking out some really nice trees, but I think longer term, Great Island will be preserved in a way that keeps many trees that otherwise would have been taken down. And so finally, the vision and master plan were delivered by the Great Island Advisory Committee with support from Reed Hildebrand, and that was in July this past summer, and they voted on that day to recommend the plan to the Board of Selectmen for their consideration. And here we are on September 7th. So the master plan vision, again, being developed with a lot of input from the public, really had four key components. First was to enable access and engagement, and that was around providing safe and inclusive access for everyone to enjoy the island and to participate in all that it could offer, from recreational and cultural activities to just being out in nature. Second is protecting and sustaining the island, both the buildings that have architectural significance as well as the island's ecosystems. Third is building community, creating opportunities for connection, for shared experiences that would strengthen the bond among citizens in town and among families and friends. And fourth, of course, was balancing development and change to the island while ensuring that we preserve nature and ecological integrity. One thing that's clear is that, and I've certainly learned in this job, is that you'll never get 100% of the people to agree 100% of the time. It's impossible. And that's true with the Great Island Master Plan. There was no way we could come up with something that was going to be 100% satisfactory to every single person in town. But we do feel with this master plan vision that we have something that works for most people most of the time. And I think that's the gold standard for assessing whether something makes sense. So coming off of the vision, the Great Island Committee developed a series of principles for developing the island, bringing people to Great Island, preserving the character and diversity of our landscape zones, prioritizing the pedestrian experience. And having walked there a bunch myself, I can say that that's very important. Connecting people to the coast and to the water, preserving architecture that's historically significant, providing opportunities for activation, which means events and activities, but reducing the impact as much as possible. Having cars, but minimizing their presence, also very important. And then finally, spaces for community events and other activities on the island, all very important design principles, not dictated by the Great Island Committee or Reed Hildebrand, but really surfaced by them through engagement with you. So how to think about this master plan. If you were to read all 160 pages, you'd find that this plan lays out a very maximum view of what could be done on Great Island. Every building, every landscape, every path, every preserved area, everything we could think of to do to get Great Island to what I would call a complete and finished state. Now, there's no reason and it's not even possible to do all of that at once. And we wouldn't want to do that. If you look at the history on Waveney Park up in New Canaan or Todd's Point down in Greenwich, they took many, many years to get those properties to where they are today. And we should take the same approach here. So we don't want to do everything in the master plan. We just want to do a few items to get started. So again, the way to look at the master plan is we've got a plan and a strategy for every aspect of Great Island. The question is how do we get started? And we think doing just a few things from the plan to get started is the best way to proceed. Frankly, the additional investments can wait. There is no rush. So it's worth briefly touching on 23A, which I mentioned before. That is, again, constructing two-lane access, also putting in a sidewalk, landscaping, lighting, and drainage. It is actually separate from the master plan. That work is already underway with appropriated funds and will end up costing about $2 million. An important aspect of the development for Great Island, but it's separate from the master plan. That construction is ongoing, and we expect the roadway to be ready hopefully by the end of December, maybe a little longer. And the landscaping, we will do that in the spring of next year when planting makes sense. Now, in terms of near term and what we recommend taking out and doing from the master plan now, and not the other things, but what we're doing now and what we want to do now is what I'm calling the early access project. So that's going to be improvements to that northern causeway roadway that's right between the traffic circle and the stables, introducing parking and bike racks, constructing a welcome center with some restrooms, constructing some utilities and infrastructure, which we really need, and a few other things like wayfinding, signs, lighting, and a replanting of the meadow, as well as a gate system. So let's check that out. But in summary, this early access project, this really is what we're recommending and what we're going to request next in terms of the Great Island. So longer term, though, as I mentioned, Great Island has a master plan with a ton of stuff in it. And here's just a listing of that, of what we might consider, say, 2 to 5 years from now. Building stabilization, that's probably something we'll come back to you all sooner rather than later. The carriage house, pedestrian trails, coastal trail, terraces at the main house and at the stables, all things that we might consider as a next phase once this early access phase is done. Longer term, ton of stuff we can do, renovating the stables, the main house, the beach, the playhouse, the boathouse. All of these things are addressed in the master plan and are all things that we could and reasonably should consider doing, but we don't have to do them right now. In any case, all of these things that you see here were things that came out of the master plan and were surfaced in conversations with many of you, but they're all things that we'll consider at a later date. Okay, so that's the summary of the master plan. Let's go into some more detail about what exactly we're requesting next for Great Island. So as I mentioned, this is the phase we're calling early access, and it has these components. So that northern causeway I mentioned, that's the northernmost roadway that comes right there at the entrance to Great Island. That's something that we need to have 2 lanes based on the parking strategy that we have. We also need to enhance it for emergency access. We need to make sure the pedestrian circulation is right there from a safety standpoint, and we'll do that. The next piece of it is parking and bike spots. So we're envisioning 50 to 60 parking spaces, which will be on gravel, as well as 30 to 40 overflow spots in a concentrated area. We'll have bike racks, we'll have handicap parking, an accessible drop-off area. And one of the things we tried to do with parking was to minimize it and disperse it, but also to try to reduce disruption, having to take down additional trees, and make it as efficient as possible. And you'll see that in the maps I'll show here in a second. We're also proposing the creation of a welcome center, which would be built in the existing root cellar that's just off from the greenhouse. We'll have a modest lobby area in there that you could go in for a basic orientation or just to get out of the heat, cold, or rain, as well as some accessible bathrooms and a little forecourt in front of that that could be a small gathering space, all again very, very modest in terms of what we're proposing. Importantly, we also need to put in some new utilities. This will be not just utilities for the Welcome Center, but utility connections that can be used when we develop more of Great Island in the future. We also need to do a little work to remediate some areas where there are some trip and fall risks. There's still some soil contamination around the greenhouse that needs to be addressed. And of course, stormwater management and general accessibility around our paths and certain barriers. We're going to take care of all of that as part of this early access phase. So let's take a look at some of this in terms of on the maps where you might find some of this, and I'll show that now. All right, here's a map of Great Island, which you've seen before. What we're talking about in terms of early access, all that work is going to be done here in this red circle. So you'll see the northern causeway there where it's labeled Great Island, and that little white building in the middle is the greenhouse, and then off to the right of that is where the current root cellar is. So in terms of a bit better map, you can see here the roadways and pathways that we're proposing for that area. The spot marked A is where the current root cellar is and where we would develop the welcome center with the restrooms and lobby. B is the little forecourt area that I mentioned, which would be a paved space that people could meet and gather, or there could be even a small event there. We've also got the bicycle parking. So you can see that'll be just south of the root cellar in an area that I've got marked C here, as well as vehicle or car parking, and that'll be all in the areas that are marked with D. And again, those will all be gravel parking spots and about 50 to 60, as I mentioned before. We'll have a little drop-off area that's labeled E here that you could come in either by private car or say an Uber or taxi and get a drop-off there so that car can then turn around and head out. And we've also got this overflow parking, which would just be in a grassy area but have about 30 to 40 spaces. Our accessible parking for ADA compliance will be up at the spot marked G. And then here on this slide, we show the woodland trail that'll be constructed right there to the left of parking. We've got some shoulder areas marked I on here, which would be for emergency vehicle staging, and then finally an access gate, which will allow emergency and town vehicles to go deeper into the island, but will restrict automobiles to this kind of far western portion of the island. Again, trying to minimize the car footprint was something that was pretty important in all the surveys and workshops. Okay. Here's a slide you may have seen that just gives a little more details in terms of what the Welcome Center and forecourt would look like. You can see the restrooms, lobby area, and the court that would be right out in front of that. You've also probably seen this slide that's got a mock-up of what the interior could look like. Again, nice, but fairly simple and not overdone, but just gives you a sense of what the bathroom areas could look like in this future vision. Now, what about projected construction costs just for the building of the lots and the Welcome Center and all of that? So for site and landscape, you see here the different components, the earthwork and soil management, putting the utilities in that I talked about, vehicle circulation and parking, pedestrian access, furnishing amenities, and the woodland and meadow restoration. All of that is, we're estimating in the $8 to $11 million range. And I want to stress at the very top right of this screen, it says preliminary estimates. These are in fact estimates. The estimates were generated by Reed Hildebrand in a thoughtful way based on their experience. But again, they are just estimates at this point. Further, we think that building the Welcome Center and the restrooms there in the $2.5 to $3 million range. And then finally, for again, construction only, early access total of between $10 and $14 million. Now, again, these are just estimates, and it's important to keep in mind that the only way we get firm totals for construction of any kind is to actually get bid documents out and get firm bids on the work from construction companies. And since this is before we have any of those bid documents, these again are just estimates, thoughtful estimates, but just estimates of construction costs. So let's talk a little bit about Reed Hildebrand. They were brought on through a competitive process. We interviewed and considered 3 other firms as part of a competitive effort to find the best group to help us. We all ended up in the end being very impressed with what Reed Hildebrand brought to the table, and it's clear from their work to date that they really have done an excellent job. I think very highly of the work that they've done and the effort that they engaged in, not just to develop the vision and principles, but how they did it in terms of gathering public input with these workshops and surveys, to writing up the final product and presenting it at the Great Island Committee meetings. Their leadership and guidance were quite critical to this entire process. Now, we really need them to come help with this next phase of work. And the big theme of that I would describe as going from plan to details. Right now is the time to take the master plan and strategy and translate that into detailed construction documents and bid documents so that we have a roadmap to build what we need to build. A company or a firm playing this role is quite common in any construction project, if not essential. And if we didn't have Reed Hildebrand doing this, we would have to have someone else doing it. It's absolutely imperative that we have this kind of help. We do believe they are best qualified for this work, not only given their expertise, but the fact that they know the town, they know Great Island, and they know the master plan better than anybody. That's going to position them to do this work and to be the most efficient at it. One thing I'd point out is that they will be less focused on communication going forward, since the Great Island Committee has now been disbanded. And when we move to a building committee, the Board of Selectmen, and mainly me, I will do a lot more of the communicating about what we're doing on Great Island. And Reed Hildebrand will certainly do less of that. And that will free them to focus on this important work in the next phase. All right, so in terms of their work, what specifically does that mean? I'm not going to read through all of this, but the first piece of work that they have to deliver are what are called CDs, or construction documents. That's pretty important because those are the detailed roadmaps that take us from plan to design. And you can see here that they've listed out the work that they're doing in phases of completion, from sort of 30% completed all the way down to 100%. The 100% completion will include not just the drawings and technical specifications, but importantly, bid documents, which will go out to construction firms. And that's what they need to actually submit formal bids for this work. Then you have approvals and permits. So it's not just the construction documents, but all of this has to be approved by Planning and Zoning, the Architectural Review Board, the Environmental Protection Commission, Sewer Commission, and of course our Fire and Emergency Services. All of those folks need to review these and approve these plans, and Reed Hildebrand will lead the charge on getting that done. Then, of course, there's the bidding process. So this is pretty complex in terms of submitting these bid documents and taking in bids from contractors and reviewing those. All of that work will be done as part of this bidding and procurement process, which will include the shop drawings, submittals, mock-ups, plannings, pavings, all of that, that work that they will complete and do. Then, of course, there's the construction administration, which overlays all of this, and the final completion of the construction documents, and then finally outputs. So progressive construction document packages, as I described, technical reports, all the cost estimates, and then, of course, bid documents that go out to the construction firms themselves. So a ton of work that needs to be done to get us from the overall master plan and strategy to final design documents that we can use to actually build out the early access phase. What is this going to cost? So included in the email that I'm going to send out with a link to this presentation is the Reed Hildebrand proposal for this next phase. You'll see that in the pages that they present, but I'm summarizing here the costs. So all the things I described, from schematics to design development to bids and procurement to observing the construction process, all of that totals about $1.772 million. Then you have some additional services that we'll need. So GZA, which has done some soil remediation work for us, we'll need them to do a study. Again, we'll need a traffic study. There will be some attorney work and obviously some support from Redness and Mead in terms of land surveys and zoning work. We'll also need to have a construction manager. Reed Hildebrand will have some reimbursable expenses, and in addition, we'll need a construction contingency of about 10%. All of that totals about $2,252,000, rounded up, call it $2.3 million. So the question you may have is, are these expenses reasonable? And we took a look at that and estimated them as a percentage of the construction costs. So if you look at the estimates we had on the prior slide, between $10 and $14 million, the Reed Hildebrand costs total between 13 and 18%, depending on where those construction costs come in. And in addition, I've got 5% down there for the construction manager. We spent time with our experts who were on the Great Island Advisory Committee, who did this type of construction work and oversight work for all of their careers. And they tell us that these figures as a percentage of the construction costs are certainly within the range of reasonable and customary. So we feel like what Reed Hildebrand has bid, as well as the cost of these other services, we do feel like they are certainly reasonable and expected for the work that we need to get done. So I want to put this slide up here to help everyone think about how we're going to do appropriation requests for Great Island in the future. So let's say we have early access like we have now, or maybe building stabilization or the carriage house in the future. Let's say one of those things come up. So each time we do that, there are going to be two separate appropriations, just like we're doing for Great Island early access. The first appropriation is what I'm going to call the Reed Hildebrand appropriation. So we have to appropriate money for them to go from master plan to detailed design. And that's what they're going to do here. And so what we want to do is we want to do an appropriation for this work first, because it's only through this work that we're going to get the bid documents and construction bids, so we know what the true project costs are. And so just throughout the Great Island process in the future and with early access now, we're going to do this appropriation first, and then we're going to follow it with the construction appropriation. That'll come a year or more later once the design work is done and once we have bids on the project, because only when we have a qualified low bidder do we know precisely what the work will cost, and then we can proceed with an appropriation request to the Board of Finance and the RTM. And so that's how to look at this. We got to have the upfront appropriation to do the bid documents. Then we have to have the second appropriation once we know what those bids are. And every Great Island appropriation will handle in the same way. Now, an important point to bring up about this is that if you vote for Reed Hildebrand and that first appropriation, you're implicitly voting that you're going to support the actual construction project when we get it later. So absent a major cost surprise, like it's dramatically outside the range of our bid estimates, or our construction cost estimates, if you're going to support Reed Hildebrand now, you probably are saying you're going to support this construction project later. So please keep that in mind. Okay. So in terms of what we're going to request for an appropriation, again, consistent with that sort of two-part appropriation I described, the rounded total for Reed Hildebrand and these other services, this $2.3 million, that's really what we want to appropriate now for this first request. $2.3 million, and that's to get these providers started on all the design work they need to do. And we want to do that now rather than waiting for an on-cycle first quarter budget request next year because we'd like these folks to get started now. In terms of the estimated construction costs that I show here on this slide, that may take 9 to 12 months to get to final numbers on that through construction bids. So as I said before, we're going to wait on that particular appropriation. There's no need to do that right now. We're going to wait until later. But as you'll see, if you combine the Reed-Hildebrand cost plus the construction costs, we're estimating that the early access project in total will cost between $12.3 and $16.3 million. Again, to be confirmed, these are just estimates. So in terms of a rough timeline for the next phase, so right now we're talking about this services appropriation of $2.3 million. The design phase, once they get started, will probably take until about the end of 2025. Doing the construction documents and bid documents, that's all going to take a fair bit of 2026 to do that. Hopefully that'll all finish by the fourth quarter. And then the bid documents, putting them out for construction bids by the end of the year, and then getting those sometime early in the first quarter of 2027. Once we have those firm numbers from a qualified low bidder, we would come back in the first quarter, again, conveniently part of the budget process that year, with a construction appropriation request. And assuming that gets approved, then the construction would start, as you see here on the timeline, kind of second quarter of 27, then hopefully finishing up a year later in early 2028. All right, so that's the early access phase. That's the Reed-Hildebrand. That's all the costs and what we're requesting for an appropriation. As you know, I sent out a survey requesting that if any of you had any particular questions you wanted me to address in this presentation, I would try to do that. And so here goes with some frequently asked questions. All right, so first question. A lot of you have been worried about just overall costs. We have spent a lot of money on schools. We've spent a lot of money buying Great Island. Debt levels, it's true, are at historic levels for the town. And some folks have said, we're really worried about that. And shouldn't we take these investments pretty slow for Great Island? And yes, we should. I agree with that. And that's actually what we've done based on your feedback. So what you see in this appropriation, which we're describing as early access, I would say is the bare minimum to get started, right? It's roadways, it's parking, it's some bathrooms and a small welcome center, just to have a central location for people to meet, and everything else we've postponed. We do feel, and I do want to say this, that the building stabilization work, some of that work also needs to be done. We're not quite ready to present it, and we might do so, say, at the end of this year or as part of the first quarter budget process. But that work would be really designed to stabilize buildings, patch roofs, patch holes and leaks, that type of thing, just to preserve the buildings so that when we work on them in the future, they won't be in a deteriorated state. Now, I would note, as I mentioned, that we've deferred on asking for anything more significant in the master plan. It is worth asking all of you, is there an appetite for adding something beyond the early access phase? Sometime in the past, we talked about the carriage house. It's a small building, and we thought, well, hey, this could be something, if we renovate it now, that could be a really great starting investment. But that preliminary cost to renovate the carriage house is an additional $3 million. And we've deferred that, but ask yourselves, do we really want to just stop now with early access, or would you like to consider something more? Think about that, and as part of the first quarter budget discussions next year, when we might come out to you for building stabilization work, ask yourself if adding the carriage house would make sense, or maybe we should wait 2 or 3 years. In any case, food for thought. Next question, when will the Board of Selectmen form a building committee? We will do that soon, hopefully by November of this year. We think that's important to get that committee in place to help join in with Reed-Hildebrand in the construction document development, as well as getting ready to put those documents out for bid. The building committee will be part of an overall management structure for work on Great Island. But I would point out that the building committee has a discrete role, whereas the Great Island Advisory Committee, that was focused on trying to make some recommendations for key decisions. That's not what building committees do. Building committees focus on how to build what's decided, not to decide what to build. So just keep that in mind for the role of the building committee. So how it fits in looks like this. The Board of Selectmen will remain sort of in an overall oversight role. The building committee will report to the Board of Selectmen, And I did want to briefly mention here that we do envision town staff getting a lot more involved going forward. So Jen Charneski, our town administrator, and Ed Gentile, our director of public works, will both be materially involved going forward and provide advice and direct counsel to not just the building committee, but the construction manager and Reed Hildebrand. Ed is going to look carefully at any proposed designs or construction and make sure he's signed off as well as the building committee itself. So they will be materially involved going forward. What about governance options? A number of folks have asked about setting up a conservancy or some similar organization with significant oversight or powers over Great Island, and we have looked at that. I do think a conservancy or some kind of similar organization is going to be important. We envision setting it up as a 501c3. My sense is they'll be involved in small dollar fundraising, perhaps with parallel town support, and have activities such as special projects, say a community garden, brick campaigns to maybe fund pathways or buildings in part, and coordinating volunteers. We did look, by the way, at the Waveney Park Conservancy up in New Canaan. That's a pretty effective group. They have about $300,000 a year in annual fundraising that they do, and the town matches that. And so they engage in a lot of the activities that I show up here, and it's just a great group to have. And I think we would do well to create something similar here. Now, I think that's important, but I don't envision this conservancy really moving the needle on Great Island funding in terms of millions of dollars. That's not what the Waveney Park Conservancy does. And I don't expect that this conservancy really would be charged with doing that kind of fundraising. Now, that said, I do think major funding from outside donors, I mean, millions, not thousands, millions of dollars, is certainly possible. And some folks with that kind of capacity have expressed an interest in contributing at that level. And we do plan to pursue those kinds of donations. And if we do get major funding and those donors would like some kind of say in maybe the governance model for Great Island, we'll structure a governance model that meets their objectives and work with them to come up with something that is effective. So it kind of depends, and let's see what those donors shape up to be, but we certainly could set something up to work with them on that. One critique that we got was, well, how come you didn't go out and get major donors when you were purchasing Great Island? They could have offset that cost. That's true, but if we'd done that, we would have had a blank slate, and those donors would have come in and said, in exchange for our millions, this is what we want done with Great Island. And so what we would have ended up with was, lots of donor support, but it would be the donors deciding what to do with Great Island, not all of you. So instead, what we did was we embarked on a process to create a master plan based on your feedback, based on your input. And now, if we go out and pursue major donors, what they're going to be doing is funding part of the master plan that you helped create rather than funding their own vision. And I think that's an important distinction to make, because now going forward, we can hopefully get donor support, but it's going to be funding something that you had a role in shaping rather than something that they wanted to do without your input. So I think this is a better model. I did want to conclude, though, by saying, in terms of governance, I'm not really in favor of creating a significant structure or committee or role that takes over management, vision, planning, and operating responsibility for Great Island. I think that ultimate responsibility belongs with elected officials. If there's something going on that you don't like, you should get different elected officials. I don't think we should outsource this to a major committee where the Board of Selectmen or other elected officials don't have a role. I think that would be a mistake, and I'm not supportive of that. What about operating costs and personnel? Well, so currently all the maintenance on Great Island is being handled by Public Works under Ed's supervision, and they are managing that just fine today with existing staff. That includes mowing and landscaping and some repair and some building maintenance and upkeep. We did sign a contract with Eastern Land Management to help with exactly that kind of work, and they're doing a lot of the landscaping support. Our expenditures in the last fiscal year were $267,000 for those operations and maintenance, as well as and included in that was the $97,000 for ELM. Now, once we get through the early phase work and we've got parking and road access, we may need additional staff or financial resources for access control, who can park on Great Island. That's going to require something like what we have down at our beaches in terms of guard shacks. Event management. If we start to have events there, we may need personnel to help support or coordinate that. And then as we have more activities and more cars, we're probably going to need additional police or third-party security to help with that. To be determined. I don't expect those expenditures to be significantly more than what we have. And if they are significant, then it's really going to be by choice, I think, rather than by necessity. So how does all this fit in with other town and school spending? Should be worried? So I did a presentation back in February about the town's finances and overall debt posture and profile. And in that presentation, I had a forecast for what our town and school capital expenditures might be between, say, 2025 and 2032. And I've replicated that here on the left, about $247 million, of which 134 is school related, and then another 113, which was town related. Interestingly, I had $50 million down for Great Island. What we're coming to you today for an appropriation is just the 2.3 million and kind of 10 to 14 million for the overall project, not anywhere close to 50 million. And except for some building stabilization work that will come to you later this year for, we're not going to get anywhere close to the 50 million in terms of what we're asking for now. We could, but certainly that's not what's envisioned. I would further note that you'll see that the 113, even with 50 million in Great Island spending, is still a lot less than what our commitment is to schools in terms of the HHR renovations, Middlesex and renovating that school, and other school capital spending. So updates on these cost figures. We did get bids in the last week on Pear Tree Point and Weed Beach. Pear Tree Point, we had budgeted 7. I had thought, as well as others, that it would be between 7 and 9 million, and that's come in at 9 million. Weed Beach, interestingly, we've got a good qualified bid for just over $2 million, which is consistent with the bid that we deferred taking a little over a year ago. So good news on all of that. I'll be doing a video on those two projects later this week because we'll also want to get them into the appropriation process for hopefully starting sometime at the end of the boat season this year. As I said, the $50 million, we're not proposing anywhere close to that right now. It's just the $12 to $16 million for the early access project, maybe a bit more for stabilization in the first quarter, but no obligation beyond those two things. And then finally, with regard to schools, that 53 million is the amount that was remaining to be bonded at the time I talked about this in February. And then finally, with regard to Middlesex, I suspect that renovation is going to be more than $60 million, but that's a fact-free suspicion at this point. What about revenue? So Great Island, like really all of our municipal government right now, it is funded with tax-exempt bonds. So tax-exempt bonds are free from federal income tax, and that's why they're attractive to a lot of folks as a tax planning matter, because you can invest in them and the interest that you get on those bonds is not taxable at a federal income tax level. They're generally not taxable at state and local levels, but that's a more complex discussion. But because they're not taxable at the federal level, the Internal Revenue Service has some rules about that. And what they do is they basically say, look, we don't want you to use tax-exempt bonds to fund things that you then go and make money from as a commercial enterprise, right? This is really meant to fund municipalities and their work. It's not meant to fund revenue generating activities. And so their rules basically say, look, if you're going to have stuff like that, then private use activities like weddings restricted to residents or donations where somebody wants their name on the building, that's going to be limited to 5% of the total amount that you've bonded for the project. Then you can have private use, but for government purpose. So an example of that would be, say, an artist. We get revenue from an artist who comes in and offers lessons, art lessons on the island. That's an example. But that's really offering, say, a program consistent with, say, what the municipality would want. And those are subject to a 10% limit. And then there's a bunch of stuff that's not limited at all. So if we, instead of offering weddings just to residents, if we just offered them to anybody who wanted them, and we had a posted price on our website, that's not actually subject to a restriction because it's available to anybody. If a donor comes in and says, I'll donate money, but no strings attached, that's not subject to a limit. We can have all of that and not have it affect our tax-exempt financing. Long story short, this is a complicated issue, but the good news is that we're going to do the following. So we've got a process to track every last dollar of Great Island revenue and to describe it precisely, and we're going to record that in our existing Great Island accounting sort of account that we have set up. And further, we're going to have an annual review with our bond counsel just to go through all those expenses so we keep track of them carefully. Now, there's no near-term risk that we're going to breach private activity revenue limits. So if you look at just the bonding that we have now of 85 million bucks in tax-exempt financing, 5% of that is $4.2 million. We're not anywhere close to that in terms of private revenue activity. It won't be for a long time. So, excuse me, it just means we need to track it. And if we get close to that, we'll deal with the financing requirements later. Now, major donors might trigger that depending on what the donor requests are. But again, if we have to do some taxable bonding, we will coordinate with our bond counsel. Bottom line is, don't worry about revenue. I think we've got a plan to track it. We won't run into any trouble on that. What about ecology or biodiversity? Some people have said, look, you really should do a detailed study on Great Island, take a year to do it, and really have a careful study of nature, ecology, and biodiversity. I would just say that the master plan includes a lot of that already. So there is extensive work been done around protection, which includes habitats, wetlands, the eagles on the island, and other wildlife. There's been a lot of work done on remediation of contaminated soil. There's a lot of work around restoration. So areas of nature that have been contaminated with invasives or areas where we need to do replantings. In short, there's been a ton of nature-focused planning that's been built into the master plan. And as such, we think that doing a further cataloging of nature with an extensive year-long or expensive plan is not necessary. We think we've done a sufficient amount of that for right now, and that our strong sense is that the master plan strikes the right balance between development and preserving nature. It does a very good job at striking that balance, and we don't think further study is warranted at this time. Now, that said, when we do form the Great Island Conservancy, we're going to ask them to help fulfill the nature provisions of the master plan and suggest new things that we could do to support the natural environment on Great Island. And we will look forward to those contributions. But again, we don't see a need for a detailed additional study of nature on Great Island at this time. But what about other spending? Is it crowding out schools and town capital spending? And the answer is a big red negative. That is not true at all. I've never heard, not once, anyone in town government say, we should cut back on school spending to fund Great Island. That is fake news. That has no basis in fact at all. In fact, the town has fully funded school capital projects. We spent $57 million building a brand new Oxford school. We're spending more than $100 million on renovations at Henley, Holmes, and Royal, and we will fund future projects that are school related, irrespective of capital needs on Great Island. In terms of operating costs, $267,000 for Great Island last year. It's going to be well below $1 million for the foreseeable future. And that $1 million is significantly less than 1% of what we spend to operate schools. So there is no worry that Great Island spending is going to crowd out town or school spending. We are committed to excellent schools in this town, as you all know, and as you all expect. And there is no Great Island spending that is going to compromise these commitments. Transportation and public access, what about that? So a number of people have asked about shuttle services. We'll assess the demand for that once the 23A, Northern Causeway, and all the other early access work is finished. We may find that once we have parking on the island, a regular shuttle service is not necessary. If we were to do that, it's not going to be cheap. We've got to have reliable drivers. We've got to come up with a schedule. It's got to be reasonably frequent. We've got to figure all that out. It's not going to be easy to set up a shuttle service. One thing, though, if we're not going to do a shuttle service, we do think that restricting parking access to Darien residents with beach passes makes sense. So in other words, what we want to do is replicate the strategy we have for our beaches. And so that strategy is during the high season, you've got to have a beach permit. and you can only get them if you're a resident. If you don't have a beach permit, whether you're a resident or not, you've got to pay a daily pass or pay for a daily pass on the beach, which I think is $70 a day. And that can be for whether you're a resident or not a resident. And we'd like to adopt the same strategy for Great Island. We can't reasonably say that you can't walk on Great Island unless you're a resident. It's just like beaches. If you're out of town, you can walk to one of our beaches. It'll be the same for Great Island. But we do think it's fair to restrict parking to folks who either have a beach pass or pay a daily access fee. We do need to figure that out, though, because we don't have guard shacks on Great Island just yet, and people are going to want to drive there year-round, and we do need to figure out that access plan, and we will do that in the coming year. And then finally, why can't we bring back horses? There are a few reasons why horses are not going to be a good fit for Great Island going forward. First, the stables, it's a pretty iconic building, probably the most iconic one on Great Island, and it's a great spot, we think, for future resident activities, whether it's art shows or weddings or anything you can think of. And if we were to say, no, we're going to reserve that space for horses, it precludes all that future activity. And the collective view is that that's a mistake. We should not do that. The other thing to point out is horses require more space than just stables. They can't just stay in the stable all day. They're going to need to be out on the island or in the dressage rink that's down there, or even on the trails. And that means sharing that space with residents. And that having horses out there, I think, just limits the activities that we can do on Great Island simply because we have to take the needs of the horses in mind. Lastly, well, in addition, there's also the issue of safety. Horses can be dangerous, and if we mix them with pedestrians and pets, it's going to introduce more safety risks for residents, horses for that matter, and increase liability for the town. And finally, entanglements. We're going to have to deal with a third party if we're going to have horses on Great Island, and that's going to introduce the potential for conflicts over or misunderstandings over management, programming, and events. I'm reminded of when the last operator that we had there, who did the horse therapy work, when they came to us for an extension of their lease, they wanted a 10-year lease. They wanted to stay there for a long time. And at the time, we were just not willing to sign up for such a significant commitment when we hadn't figured out what we were going to do with Great Island. So long story short, too difficult, I think, to keep horses on Great Island. And unfortunately, we can't go back to that. Okay, let's bring it home with a quick summary here. A lot of time went into the development of the master plan. As I said, it encompasses everything we could think of. And because of all the robust public input that many of you provided, as well as the professional expertise from Reed Hildebrand and all the great work from the Great Island Advisory Committee, we think we have a master plan that works for most people most of the time. Now, we're not going to do the master plan all at once. That's just a roadmap for how Great Island is going to be developed. And instead, we are going to focus on just the basics. So basic access and parking, bathrooms, utility, safety, other essentials, with an estimated completion date of early 2028. We can wait on these additional investments. And the question is what do you think about that? We are definitely going to need Reed Hildebrand support for this next phase. We're going to need them as well as a few other providers and a construction manager. It's simply going to be impossible to create all the detailed documents that we need to get to bid documents without their support and oversight. We are asking for an appropriation of $2,300,000 to get Reed Hildebrand and these other providers started on planning for early access. The voting for which will imply support for the still to come first quarter 2027 construction appropriation, again, which we estimate to be between $12 and $16 million. I know I'm personally excited about the future of Great Island, and a lot of us are. We believe that this approach takes it slow, as many of you have requested, and will allow us to get things right. Early access is what we're asking for now. We do think we'll come back to you in a few months with building stabilization. But again, ask yourself, is this all we want to do right now? Or in the first quarter, should we look at maybe a little bit more spending with something like the carriage house? Think about that over the next few months. And when we talk about building stabilization in the first quarter, let's have another talk about whether something like the carriage house would make sense to add. And finally, this really was just meant as a way to summarize things and ensure a common understanding at a high level. We have a lot of materials to sort through, which I've read, and hopefully this summary helps you both understand where we've been and where we are at the moment and what this next phase looks like and what we're requesting. If you do want to look at the details, I'll include links to the Board of Selectmen meeting where we talked about the Great Island Master Plan as well as the master plan itself. And take a look at that if you want. I will also send out a copy of these slides as well as read Hildebrand's detailed proposal for the next phase. Take a look at any of those materials. I am available to speak by phone or meet with any of you to answer additional questions. Drop me a note or just pick up the phone and call me. Here's my cell phone number and my email address. I'll also include that in the email. I will answer your questions or I will direct you to someone who can. So that's really all I wanted to say today. I wanted to make sure you had a chance to see what we were offering, see where we've been, and really get your questions answered before we come to you with these appropriation requests. The Board of Selectmen's meeting tomorrow night, September 8th. Then we will have that followed by Board of Finance and the representative town meeting later this month. But we'd like to get this appropriation in place by the end of September so Reed Hildebrand and others can get started. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to any of your further questions, and I would be happy to attend any upcoming meetings to participate and help get this over the goalpost. Thanks for your attention and have a great day.